Hey everyone, I'm Georgia, a psychologist from the 3P Psychology Service. You're watching Shrinking the Stigma, Speaking with Psychologists. This is where I speak with other psychologists about their professional experiences in order to shed light on what psychologists do, where you might find them, and dispel a couple of myths along the way. Today I'm joined by my friend Mel. Mel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Mel. I'm a psychologist and I've worked in various different mental health settings through training. But today I'm here to talk to you about trauma, as I've just been working in a specialist trauma service.
Mm-hmm. Fab. So should we start by covering the real kind of basics? Because I think we spoke about kind of off camera beforehand, how I feel like as a society, and I know I do it, talk about trauma in quite a colloquial way, such as like, I spilled my coffee, it was traumatic. I missed the train, it was traumatic. And although I know that's not actual trauma, I think we do use it very colloquially. So I think it might be good to starting with more of a definition of trauma.
Yeah, that's a really good starting point. And I guess I should say that, so we're going to be talking about trauma today. And I don't think we'll be I'm not going to be going into lots of detail about traumatic events. I'm really going to be thinking about like trauma and PTSD and how we respond to that in a service. But trauma, touches all of our lives, and hearing even a little bit of detail about something can feel really upsetting and can bring stuff up for us. And so if you're like starting to watch this and thinking, actually, I've already had a bit of a tough day, I just want to look after myself, this might be one to miss. And you can go and watch Netflix for 15 or 20 minutes, or have like a hot bath or a candle. I don't know, these are all things that I do, but yes, we should start at what trauma is, because you're right. I think language as a whole is just changing so much, and how we use language. And so now when the word trauma is said, it could be like referring to so many different things. Sometimes when we're with friends, like you've said, we can say trauma for something that we just kind of want to get across that it was a bit frustrating and impacted our day. Sometimes we can use trauma actually as a way to try and be like, this is really different from what I normally experience. So we'll say like traumatic or trauma, and it's kind of in that realm still. These are all like fair ways to use the word, but it just means we don't always necessarily know what we're talking about. So I think maybe it'd be useful to define it now, would be when we're thinking about trauma in a clinical setting, and something that we see in clinical services, we're looking at an event which has really severely creates an impact, an intense emotion to us. So it's a very horrifying, threatening, serious event, which you might have experienced actual threat to your life or to somebody else's life, or a felt sense of threat to your life or somebody else's life. And it can cause really intense emotions of fear, horror, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness, actually, when this experience or this event is going on. So that's kind of like a broad definition of what we're talking about. So that quite intense end of how we'd use the word trauma or traumatic experiences. But even within that, there's lots of different types and lots of different distinctions to what you might have experienced, which I think might be useful to mention here. But
go for it. No, go for it. It's really helpful.
So I guess there's a difference that you can have trauma that you've experienced yourself. So you've experienced it. You also might have trauma that you've witnessed. So you might have witnessed, say, an accident where somebody was really hurt, or you might have witnessed awful events if there's been war in your country and you've been witnessing that. You might also have interpersonal trauma, which is the kind of term we give to when you've been harmed at the hand of another person. So it's kind of human trauma. You also might have experienced things that are more like a natural disaster or an accident. So when the tsunami hits, that would fall under that category. And these aren't distinct categories. You can experience something that has touched upon all those things. You might have witnessed something and experienced something at the same time. But we have these slight categories just so we can better understand how it might have impacted you as a person, or what you might have experienced. There's also different types in terms of frequency of what you might have experienced. So you can have acute trauma, which is when you've had like a single traumatic experience. Perhaps you've been a victim of an assault or part of a road traffic accident, and it's been really, really difficult, really traumatic single incident. You might have chronic trauma, which is when your traumatic experience has happened over a long period of time. So we could think of childhood abuse as chronic trauma if it continued, you know, through the ages of a certain age period. We can think of domestic violence as chronic abuse. We might be in that relationship for a really, really long time. We could think of racial trauma as chronic trauma, you know, the continued experience of stigma and discrimination to yourself and to people who share your ethnicity, seeing that all the time on a global level. And then there's another one which is called complex trauma, which is it's kind of looking at somebody who might have experienced a lot of different types of trauma throughout their life. So we can also see that in people who've had a journey to the UK, if they're seeking asylum or a refugee, and they might have experienced a lot of different types of trauma, be it accidental or natural disaster at the hands of another person on just their journey to the UK. So these are like kind of loose categories that we can think of as a way to understand what you might have experienced, but they're not distinct and they can overlap. And I guess they might also determine maybe the type of therapy that might be most useful for you to help with what you've experienced, that has the best evidence base for that kind of trauma that you've experienced. So yeah, they're loosely it. I also think, and I think we touched upon this before, that there's types of trauma that are spoken about a little bit more, that we might be like a bit more aware of, and then there's some that we're not as aware of, or are even developing as we go through life, that we didn't have a term for, and then a term develops, and retrospectively we realize, well, this has been here for a really long time, but this is now what we're talking about. So I think that can sometimes play into how we use the word trauma, because it isn't something that's holistically always covered in how we speak.
Yeah, definitely. I would say things like car accidents or veterans that like coming back from war. I think they're really common to speak about the kind of trauma that might have happened. I think that's spoken about for a while, but whereas something I'd say racial trauma is something that's come into people's lenses a bit more recently. Although we know it's been there for ages, it's only more recently being spoke about. So I think that's really important to distinguish that.
Yeah,
there are so many wide varieties, but sometimes we only talk about specific ones.
Sometimes we might not recognize that we've experienced that. We might be a victim of that, or in some level our lives have been touched by that, and actually it can be a really upsetting thing to hear that label. It might also be a really important thing to think, yeah, I've survived that, I'm surviving that right now, and I'm happy that's being recognized, or I have a word for that. It's a very like unique experience, I guess, whether that's a helpful or an unhelpful word to have. So
say someone had trauma, they kind of had a trauma, or they've been diagnosed with trauma or PTSD or something, kind of what would be, and they came to see you, what would be what should they expect, what would happen, what would things kind of look like?
Yes, okay, yeah, I'm so glad you said that, actually, because you're right. So all of us might have experienced a type of trauma. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll develop post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So if you've experienced something and you then develop PTSD, that's when you'd be seen maybe in a specialist trauma service, although you can be seen in lots of different services to work on trauma. It doesn't have to be a specialist clinic, but that's really kind of the bread and butter of what specialist clinics do. And I guess there's like a phased model of treatment that happens when you come to the service. And the first part would be quite a detailed assessment, just to understand what's happened to you, what you've survived, and how that's impacted you. Because a really big part as well is not just the symptoms of PTSD that you're experiencing, but it's how they've then impacted all the things that you enjoy in life, and like the things that used to make up who you are. You know, you might have been a person who liked to go out or to socialize, or to I don't know, do sports, and all these things are really difficult when we're experiencing PTSD, which is essentially experiencing a current sense of threat. I don't know if it'd be helpful for me to talk about PTSD before talking about treatment. What would you prefer?
Maybe let's think about treatment. Let's stick with the stage model, because I was also thinking one of the worries I can anticipate people would having is in this first stage, this assessment, is an idea that they would just come to you, have to talk about this really horrific event, and then it's like, oh, see you later, I'm off. Would you be able to talk about kind of how you prepare people for that session, the padding around it, what they are expected to talk about, what you need them to talk about?
Oh, definitely. And I think that's a really important point, because the assessment, I mean, it's such a scary idea to come and speak to a stranger about something that you might feel a lot of fear or shame or anger or guilt, you know, all these really intense emotions that trauma can stir up and leave you with, which are often not your emotions to bear. And so coming for the first time to speak can be really scary. What I'd say is that what the point of the assessment is just trying to find enough detail to know how we can help. And a lot of that is based on the symptoms that you're experiencing. One of the things we'll be thinking about is how long you've been experiencing, like firstly, just what are you experiencing in your own words? And then we might go a little bit more deeper into the exact symptoms of PTSD in terms of flashbacks or nightmares, intrusive memories, how that experience of those really upsetting symptoms might have impacted your behavior, what your best efforts to cope have been. And they can be things that have helped reduce the feeling of the symptoms, but now might be actually a little bit harmful for us, or we just kind of wish we weren't doing. Or they can be things that are really helpful to us, those kind of strength-based coping strategies.
I think that's a really important point you touched on. I think with the strengths-based approach, I think there's almost, people have an assumption that if I go to therapy, it's because I'm not doing it correctly. I can't do it, I can't do this. But actually through assessment, a lot of the time you might realize you've actually tried a lot of things and you've just run out of ideas and it's just not working. But you might have tried something, some things work, some things don't. And sometimes an assessment is part of building that portfolio of what works and what doesn't work, because there's no point us telling you, have you tried this? And actually you have tried that, it doesn't work.
No, exactly. And I think particularly when you've experienced a trauma, you might have had to do a lot of different things to be able to cope with those specific symptoms. And actually those things might have been the very reason that you've survived and you're sat here today. But maybe there's a recognition that, maybe you're feeling tired of just surviving and you want to like thrive. Maybe there's a recognition that these things that worked really well back then aren't working now. And it's coming back into, well, what would you like to work? And what have you been trying? And that sounds really helpful. Can we build on that? Or what would you like life to be like? And can we find a way to go that way? And then there will be, of course, speaking about the trauma, we'll only take detail to know kind of what you're left with. So what flashbacks are coming back? Can we think about what some of those triggers might be? And so they might have specific details in it. It is scary. I think, can't take that away. But your therapist, your psychologist knows that, and we'll take every single measure we can to try and make it a comforting and welcoming environment, going at your own pace. We always have lots of grounding objects in the room, so scented oil, a stress ball, you can have a blanket, just something that might make it feel a little bit safer. And it isn't something we'll just launch into as soon as you've sat down. We really try and take a lot of time, and because of that, actually our assessments are a lot longer than other services. They're normally around up to 2 hours. So we have quite a lot of time just to take it slow. But it is a big one. It is a scary one. And I think with these things, it's like the first time we talk about it is really difficult. It gets easier after that.
It sounds like it's...
So after the assessment, then...
It's a risk to come back at the same time there's reward with it. Does that make sense? There's risk and reward to everything.
Exactly.
And it can't be... It's very difficult to work through a trauma without at least slightly touching on what the trauma is.
And I think it can be, these things aren't, what's the right, there's a saying for this, you don't just have one shot at this. It's like, if you come to an assessment and you begin to talk about trauma and it feels a bit too much, or if you get offered an assessment and you think, no, I don't know if I'm there yet, I don't think I want to go there, I don't think I'm ready yet to speak about this, that's okay, you can come back, you can have it another chance. Maybe there's some more a different focus you could do for a little bit about feeling safer within our bodies and feeling safer within our minds before we do that, and that's completely fine. It's not a closed door, it's just a different route on the journey.
Yeah, great. So say people come to you, they manage to get through the assessment, they're feeling okay with it, they've kind of gone home, you've worked through the assessment stage. What's kind of do you call it level 2? What's kind of the next stage?
Yeah, well, so then within treatment, there's 3 phases. I think this is one approach to trauma focused work. Other services might do it differently, or like it might differ by service, but there's normally around 3-phased approach, which the evidence shows for, which the first one is about like some education about what PTSD is, some information. We call it psychoeducation, but just information about what it is that we're experiencing. And a big reason that we start that bit is that actually the experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder can feel really scary. Like having a flashback can feel like a very scary thing, but it's a normal response. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation that you've been through. And so just hearing about why our brain might do that, or why our mind has responded in this way, or why our body feels this way, can be quite empowering to know that what you're experiencing is normal. It's expected. It's actually a sign that your mind is working how we think minds work. And there's ways to respond to it as well. So then we teach some just grounding strategies, some really like basic and easy things to go off and try like immediately in our day-to-day lives that can help us feel safer in our bodies and our minds. And that can be like breathing exercises, meditation, like gentle yoga poses, some imagery work that we can do, and like a nightmare protocol to try and take some of the like vividness and nowness out of nightmares straight away. So we do that at the beginning, and that can either be like individually or it can be in a group format. Then the next phase would be, once we feel safer in our bodies, would be something we call like memory reprocessing. So this stage
sounds so fancy.
No, it sounds like magic. Memory reprocessing. It's kind of, because PTSD it's an experience where something in memory, really, when we go through a trauma, when we feel intense emotions like fear or threat, it makes it really difficult to encode our memories, to store our memories like we normally do. And so our memories don't get the normal things like a timestamp to say it's happened in the past, or linking in with our other memories, so it's part of our story. And they don't get updated either with new information as we learn, as we continue on our journey. And so because of that, when they're triggered, like all memories are, by something that's similar, like a similar sight or sound or taste, it feels like it's happening again, because when those worst moments come up, when we were the most scared, they don't have a timestamp on, and they don't have that autobiographical memory. So that phase is really, it's very based in this like how we understand the mind to work, and we just revisit the trauma in detail and update it, give it a chance to update it, and for our mind to realize it's in the past with the emotions slightly lowered down. And there's loads of different techniques for that, like absolutely loads of branches. It might be CBT with like words as our update. It might be images. Our minds love images. They're so powerful. And so we can create a different picture of ourselves, or an update of ourselves now safe in this new place. We can change the ending to express a need that we needed to at the time that we couldn't. We might do something called narrative exposure therapy, which was designed to work with refugee communities, people who've experienced trauma that's been caused by political and societal and cultural or ethical issues. And that's a really, what's the word when you're really active? We make like a lifeline by laying down stones where traumas has happened, flowers where like joyous moments have happened, and candles for losses.
So like very hands-on.
Really hands-on, which is quite nice when we're talking about something difficult, to kind of have something to focus on and both be making together. And it creates this really beautiful picture afterwards, and narrative that we type up. There's actually so many. There's eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, EMDR. Yeah. I think I've got that. I'm not trained in that one, so I can't really speak for it, but
that is a specialist,
again, it has something to focus
training
on. Yeah. And compassion, learning a little bit more about how the emotions we feel are a product of our brain and how that's evolved. And so it's not our fault. We're just all here living our life, entering into the flow of life. And it can be really helpful if we've been left with shame after our trauma. So that's the bit that we'd be really talking a lot in detail about the traumatic experience that we've survived. And then the phase 3 is this thing we call reclaiming life. It could have loads of words, but I think that's quite a nice title, where it's that bit at the beginning we were talking about. What is it that you used to love, that brought joy to your life, that helped with your identity, that made us, I'm this kind of person? Really understandably, when we've been through something, it's harder to do all those like pleasurable activities because we need to just survive, and we're experiencing loads of awful emotions. So we're trying to rebuild our life so we can go back into the things that bring us joy and love and interest and excitement. So they're the kind of 3 phases, and they're not done linearly. It's not necessarily in a straight line. We'll start off with phase 1, but it might be that we come into phase 2, we think actually it'd be useful to do a bit more grounding strategies, let's go back into it. We might do reclaiming life from the moment we had the assessment, if that's linking up with other services in your area that you think you'd like to get back into, if it's joining a group in the clinic, like a yoga group or a baking group or a socializing group, like they're all merged into one, but we've got these areas that we're saying, there's these 3 phases. And it's really dependent on the person, what they bring as well, what would be most helpful to start at.
Yeah, sort of adapting to that person's needs, what they bring, what they want from it as well, what's kind of most important. Because I imagine if one of the biggest things is that you've stopped going to your local sports club, then I know that's going to be on the therapist's radar to get you back there as quickly as possible, and a main motivator.
Yeah.
Fab. So earlier we spoke about
definitely
possibly covering, just briefly touching on kind of PTSD. Did you want to have a think through kind of surface level, kind of how that might present, how people might see it, what's the kind of symptoms?
Definitely. So PTSD is an umbrella term. It talks about 4 different symptom areas, and then within that, different symptoms you might experience. So your experience of PTSD might be very different of my experience of PTSD. We can have 2 people with the same diagnosis who just experience very different things, and that's really, really normal. It's because it's this umbrella with lots of things under it. But if we just thought about those 4 areas, so technically PTSD is our response to an abnormal event. It does not mean you'll always develop PTSD when you've been through a trauma. But if you do, there's these 4 main symptoms. And the first is something that we call re-experiencing, which is a fancy way of saying that the trauma, those parts of it, are coming back into your mind when you don't want them to. So one of those would be flashbacks, which is when we feel like we're reliving a bit of the trauma in our day-to-day life. So it's happening in our present day. And that might be a certain smell or a certain sight, a certain feeling in our bodies, or a certain taste or sound. And it's not normally in order, so it might just be random bits of the memory coming almost like a cinema screen in front of your eyes, and you'll feel how you did back then, but you also might act like you did back then. And that's really normal. It's just because the memory's coming back into our mind, it doesn't have that past stamp on it, so it feels like it's happening in the present day. Part of that is also nightmares, so very similar to flashbacks, but we're asleep. Night terrors, and when we wake up, we might feel like we're back there. It might feel really disorientating, actually. We might find our body responding, being very sweaty, or like our heart pounding to what we've just experienced. It doesn't feel like a dream. It feels like we were just having that trauma again. We also might have intrusive memories, and they're the kind of memories that you're just going about your day and it just pops into your mind a little bit of what you've experienced in the past, and it doesn't feel like it's happening again, but it's something you don't want in your mind. You've not got a control over it. It just keeps popping in. So all of that is part of this thing we call re-experiencing, and that's really what we're working on in that phase 2 part of the treatment. Another part of PTSD is avoidance, and that can be external avoidance. So, not going to certain places, or seeing certain people, or watching certain TV programs, listening to the news, anything that might remind you of what you've survived, you might avoid. And that's your best effort to cope. As humans, we want to avoid things that make us feel bad. We're wired to do that. And so that might help in the short term with the PTSD symptom, like the flashbacks or the nightmares. But, it takes a lot of energy to constantly avoid places. We might do less of the things we used to love, and so feel less like ourselves. And I think you hear that a lot when people feel after a trauma, I don't feel like myself, I feel like I'm changed. And that's a big part of it. We also might avoid internal reminders like thoughts or feelings. And that's really difficult to do. To try and avoid a thought coming into your mind is so draining. Or doing drugs or hurting ourselves, anything that replaces the feeling that we don't want at the time. Really, really understandable ways to avoid something awful that we're experiencing. Then the third symptom is something we call hyperarousal, and it means our body is essentially feels like it's being threatened. So we're in this current state of threat. And because of that, we're like primed for our fight or flight. So we might find ourselves scanning the environment we walk into, or when we're out and about, being really hypervigilant. We might experience a startle response when there's a noise and we find ourselves really jumping because we're so on edge and ready to either fight or run, that we feel that constantly. And that can have quite a long-term impact on our health. We can develop chronic pain from our muscles constantly being tensed. We can have damage to our immune system, a suppressed immune system from constantly being ready to fight. And so we see, this interaction between our mind and our body and our physical health being impacted by what we've had to survive. And that's why doing things like yoga and meditation can be really helpful to just calm down that hyperarousal that we might not even be noticing we're feeling. And then the last one is the beliefs we hold about ourselves and others in the world. So when we've experienced a traumatic event, it can really impact how we feel about ourselves. We can take on emotions that are never ours to feel, and we don't deserve to feel. And that might make us feel like we're bad, or we're weak, or we're changed. We might think other people are hostile or dangerous. The world might be a very dangerous place. You can think about how all of these things kind of interact together. We label them to see, it might be useful to know that's something you're experiencing, but they overlap so much, those different symptoms.
I think kind of another thing you're kind of highlighting is just how powerful our brains are, and how just to not underestimate how our brains are, and that brain-body connection is just, you can't underestimate it. It's so, so powerful. And I can see why it just sounds like so debilitating, kind of having all those things happening. And I know they kind of happen on a spectrum in terms of some people experience some mildly, some more severely, and it will massively vary. But I suppose the overwhelming thing I'm kind of left with is how, if it is something you're experiencing, how important it could be to get some additional support. And there's no kind of no shame in it at all.
Absolutely no shame, and that recognition that what you're experiencing is not your fault. This is what happens. This is just our brain's best efforts to cope with something so abnormal that should never have happened, and that can be really tiring when that has to continue for a long time. And so coming in can just give your body and your mind a break from feeling that threat that you're under. And all those ways to cope, that's probably got you here, that's fine. It's just thinking about what's the most helpful thing for you now, and are there things that you've not tried that we could explore together, or like find out together on this journey. I do think that is definitely a thing. And I think because PTSD, it isn't just when you experience a trauma, it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily develop PTSD. And there's such a huge amount of research looking at the different factors that can contribute to somebody experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're so plentiful, and the combination of them, it might be the type of trauma or the frequency or the intensity of trauma. It might not be. It might be how much other life stresses you've been under or currently under at the time of your trauma, how much social support and financial support you have, how much are you already dealing with, and is there somebody there who can help you make sense of this massive thing? I think there's just so many different combinations, and I think sometimes we can see when people come, we think, oh, what is it about me that's not coping with this, or why can't I get over this? And actually, we're just humans existing in this huge sphere of things going around us, and those things combine and can impact how we feel. There's often so many things going on outside of us that are so beyond our control that contributed to how we're feeling, and that's a really important thing to look at in therapy, because figuring out some of those factors can really help with the shame and guilt that you never deserve to feel when you're experiencing PTSD.
I think that's a really important kind of myth to kind of work through, is that two people who experience the same event one may get like develop PTSD, the other they might not. It can feel, when you look at it, it can feel a bit random. There are a few kind of factors that we've seen in research that can predict things, but at the same time, it's not a reflection on you as a person at all. It's a reflection on a situation. And it's nothing to kind of, I think there is a lot of shame around PTSD, and that's a kind of a cultural thing, but it's something that I think there is a lot of support there for in services like the one you're talking about.
Yeah. And I think I have a hope, and I think this services are going towards this as well, for this idea of a bit more of trauma-informed care within services. So we have specialist services that are just working with trauma presentations, but actually you can, like, your experience of trauma, you can bring to any service that you're at. You can talk about it anywhere. And if we shift the focus in mental health from, you know, what's wrong with you, what are you experiencing, to what has happened to you and how have you survived, that opens the door to really start embedding trauma across the spectrum, from very intense to everyday to whatever we're using that word, into how it impacts who we are and what we're dealing with. And particularly in times when your traumatic event might still be happening, it might be happening to other people, in terms of the seeing other people who are seeking asylum in the UK, and the way the media is covering that, which is really hard to watch, particularly if you have lived experience in that. Racial trauma, having this connection with the global atrocities that are occurring, and seeing this every day in different spheres, in education and health and psychology and, I don't know, politics. I think having a trauma-informed approach to care, where we talk about this a lot more and think about it, is really useful. And that's a myth, that it doesn't just have to be a specialist clinic. You can get help from, there's lots of places out there, and community projects as well that are really working hard to provide care.
Thanks, Mel. So I'm just something to end on. I was thinking, if people wanted to access trauma services, like specialist services such as the one you're in, I'm not really sure, is the GP the first point of call, or what would be the best thing?
Yeah, so your GP would refer you, or perhaps you might have gone and spoken to a different service like IAPT, and they might have thought, actually, I think your needs could be better met at a specialist clinic, and they can refer you over. There's also some charity organisations which accept self-referrals that you can Google in your area. I think one thing to be clear about is, in the more specialist services, there are very long wait lists. And that is a reflection of, I think, firstly, how widespread trauma is, you know, how it touches upon so many people's lives, and perhaps the need for more services that are specialist in trauma. And because of that, there can be upwards, you know, up to 2 years sometimes waiting for individual therapy. You see things beforehand, but that individual phase 2 work. And so the more less well-known services and charity organisations that are out there can be really useful to make sure that you're seen a bit quicker. There is also an element that, because of a long wait list, if actually you're at a point of your life where you've been experiencing this for so long and it's feeling quite unbearable, and you might be feeling a bit more closer to crisis, that's like a more specialist service which has a long wait list might not be right for you, because there's this long time before you're seen. And so that's where you're integrating trauma work in other services that might be more aligned with the crisis.
Yeah, I think that's why it's best to kind of go to your GP, and they can assess the situation and help you decide what service is best for you at the time you're at.
Definitely. Yeah.
Thanks, Mel. That's been so interesting, and I think that's really helpful information for people to know more about.
Oh, I'm really glad. There's so much, I think, and I think there's so much I haven't spoken about that you could have 5 more episodes on thinking about trauma. But I hope that's at least a bit of an overview that's touched on a few areas. And I guess the one message I'd just say is that, if you or anyone you know is experiencing PTSD, again and again, it is a normal response to an abnormal event. It's not a weakness. So come get help.
Perfect. Thanks, Mel.
Anyways, see ya.